The lack of insight in most narcissistic people, coupled with the grandiosity, means that people who are narcissistic are good at talking, but they're not good at doing, because the doing is inconvenient and troublesome. And words are often sufficient for them to prop up their fragile egos. They'll talk a good game, and just the talking is enough for them to say, oh, I'm great, but they don't connect it to the doing. Today we're going to be taking on a very good proverb that's relevant to narcissistic personality and narcissistic relationships, which is, don't cast pearls before swine. So let's take a look at what this rather ancient proverb about pearls and pigs really means. This is a phrase that may not be as popular as some of the other ones we've done, such as absence makes the heart grow fonder. But many of you may be familiar with this phrase. The metaphor here is to not give the best of something, or one could say the best of someone, to somebody who cannot appreciate it. The origin of the phrase is actually from the New Testament, from the Gospel of Matthew. So once again, the roots go deep on this one. So much, I mean, whoever knew that the Old and New Testaments were, instruction manuals on narcissism. The original telling of the proverb relates to the sharing of religious teaching to those who cannot appreciate it. But since then, it has expanded to something far broader, to not put something of value and put it in front of something or someone that cannot appreciate it. Now, I am the first one to acknowledge that this saying actually has some snobby top notes to it, and I'm not a big fan of snobbiness or elitism. For example, someone who may be, for example, a very snobby wine person, would say to give expensive wine to someone who would prefer to drink a $2 bottle of wine. They may call that pearls before swine. Or high fashion, like let's say you're giving high fashion, like Chanel, to someone who wears bargain close store clothes. The high fashion person would call that pearls before swine. And I can tell you right now, I'm somebody who knows absolutely nothing about wine and absolutely nothing about fashion. So I suppose to give me a Chanel jacket or a bottle of Chateau Lafite would actually be pearls before swine. I can live with that when I'm concerned, but I don't like snobby stuff that hurts other people. But if we can get past the snobby top notes, this saying actually has some real relevance to narcissistic relationships. In thinking about it, like this idea of pearls, in thinking about it as giving the best, most loyal, devoted self to a person who has no empathy or is entitled or is contemptuous of your vulnerability. That's what it gets at. To give the best of yourself to someone who merely views you as a vessel to meet their needs rather than as a human being. The difficulty of narcissistic relationships is that people in these relationships keep trying harder and harder. They keep trying harder to be nicer, to be more attractive, to be more clever, to listen to everything that they say, to go along with all of their interests, to do everything on the narcissistic partner's terms. And yet, all of that is more often than not rejected. In essence, you are bringing the best of yourself to this person, and it is devalued and invalidated. So in this version, the pearls are you giving the best of yourself. And unpleasant as it is, in this analogy, that makes a person who is narcissistic the swine. I know that seems a bit harsh, but that's the proverb. I didn't write that part of it. So one lesson that people are rarely taught is to be mindful and intentional about whom you give the gift of yourself and your goodness to. Certainly, we can and should all go forth into the world and be our best selves. However, when those best selves are met with invalidation, manipulation, devaluation, minimization, and dismissiveness, then we can also rein it in a bit and hold back. Pay attention to the lack of reciprocity and mutuality and respect, and view that as a moment that we can set a boundary. There is no need for this to devolve into two-way antagonism, but rather it involves holding back the process of putting the best of ourselves in front of someone who doesn't appreciate it. The strategy behind gray rock, in fact, converges with this pearls before swine proverb. Gray rock actually does mean that you aren't putting your proverbial pearls out there, but rather maybe just gray rocks. You are engaging, but at a superficial level that reciprocally meets the superficiality of the narcissistic relationship, right? Superficial mirrors superficial. You can actually make that survive for a little while. When I watch or witness a person give the best of themselves to someone who is rejecting them, who is speaking rudely and contemptuously to them, who is talking over them and behaving badly with them, who lies to them and deceives them, this proverb has always come to mind. This idea of watching someone's best, the best of someone, being given to someone who doesn't even notice it and who criticizes it and devalues it. This proverb always comes to mind. I have seen people who are literally angels among us be disrespected and rudely dismissed by difficult and narcissistic people, and it leaves me seething because I know how many people in the world would be so appreciative of that good person's kindness, and yet, pearls before swine, the narcissistic person has no appreciation. The original proverb actually reflected a sort of biblical gray rocking, the idea that you really shouldn't engage in teaching scripture to a person who is not ready to receive it. So there you go. The New Testament was actually offering up an ancient version of a technique, gray rocking, that can be used to manage difficult relationships. Don't teach someone something that they really, really aren't ready to receive. Now listen, the odds of a pig wearing a pearl choker are about the same as a person in a very difficult, antagonistic, and narcissistic relationship experiencing the level of appreciation and regard that are necessary to make a relationship healthy. And if any of you see that well-accessorized pig walking about, please send me a picture because I'd love to see it. I always am welcome to hope because I got to tell you, in the world I walk around in, things often look very, very bleak. So there you go, pearls before swine. Think about it the next time you are considering putting the best of yourself in front of a narcissistic person. Today we're going to talk about a dynamic that often arises in these relationships, and it has to do with a certain form of dissonance. It's this idea that, when we have a lot of investment in something, we want to make it work out. Okay, it's sort of this sort of dissonance around, I've already invested this much, I want to keep in the game. So let's talk a little bit about this, because the way I'm approaching this is it's a dissonance of winning the narcissist over, and then because you worked so hard to win them over, wanting to keep them. So I'm going to put this to you. It's the story of the monkey and the coconut. I'll tell you about that story at the end of this video. So sometimes we hold on to things we fight for, not because they're good for us, but because we worked so hard to get them. I think as the old saying goes, it's good money after bad, though I prefer to think of it as bad money after good. Now, an element of love bombing that often gets overlooked is the hard to get phase of the love bombing. It doesn't always happen, but it can happen quite often. You will see the dashing, attractive, narcissistic person across a room. They may not be available to you. They may not be paying attention, or they may be looking and looking away. Maybe they actually aren't available. They have a partner. They may not really be showing interest in you. And fate on that night that you meet the dashing narcissist may not be your friend, and the best laid plans get thrown off. It just seems that it wasn't meant to be, and you are bummed out because you only got a little bit of a taste, a tiny nibble of the charm and charisma offensive, enough to entice you, but not enough to offend you. Maybe you even tried to stay in touch with this person, but you kept missing each other due to bad timing, a missed call, a missed message, somebody was out of town. Another pattern that you may have experienced is the approach avoidance pattern, which is so classical in narcissistic relationships. You reach in to the relationship, and that's exactly when you really start reaching in more. They pull back. When you pull back, all of a sudden they become interested and they reach in. All of this, the bad timing, the plans falling through, the approach, the avoidance, the dance. So when the moment comes that the charm and the charisma of the narcissistic person meets good timing, and there's more approach than avoidance, eureka! You think you have found magic. The slipperiness of the narcissistic relationship plays out during all phases of the relationship. The love bombing, the devaluing, the discarding. The narcissistic person pulls away. They gaslight. Or in the early phases of a relationship, you don't get to partake as much, right? They're hard to see, hard to get. It makes the allure of them all the more powerful. We always want what we can't have. And this is one of the dangers of the narcissistic relationship. They play upon the fearful scripts of the one that got away that so many people have. And that idea, oh, this is the one that got away. If for any reason they come back towards you, you may blindly fight for them. The storytelling of rom-coms and fairy tales and love stories, you know how those all unfold. People almost missing trains, or almost missing planes, or actually missing planes, or Cinderella's shoe, and every other love story that's made all the more profound or hampered by bad timing. It means that when you finally get your turn, your crack at bat with the narcissistic person, and that narcissistic person is back, or they seem like they're more interested, they do their own hoovering. This time, you don't want to lose them. Many people will say that they worked so hard to get the narcissistic partner into their lives, or put so much effort into the relationship. For example, doing it long distance, or they waited so patiently, or the timing felt like a once-in-a-lifetime situation, or the narcissistic partner finally got out of their marriage or whatever long-term relationship they were in, or dating relationship they're in, that once they kind of get their prize of the narcissist now with them, that people force the relationships to make them work because they feel like they work so hard to get them. The challenges of getting the narcissistic partner in the first place can really play heavily into the cognitive dissonance. I'm so lucky that it finally came together. You want the love story. You're like, it finally happened. This is my love story. Are you really going to be, grousing over them being late? So when the ickier stuff starts to seep in, the gaslighting and the manipulation and the insults and control, or whatever that difficulty looks like, you justify. Of course you justify. You waited so long for this. Are you really going to let them being late, or having poor boundaries, or being controlling, or being rageful, or being pathologically jealous, or disparaging your work, whatever it is, you justify and rationalize so as to break that dissonance. And it all feels right again. And all of a sudden you're able to think, this is my love story. Really? I have a love story, an epic love story, and I'm not gonna complain about a little bit of lateness. My partner's stressed. Rage, they're passionate. And gaslighting, that's this kind of psychobabble. That's nothing that's happening here. You feel as though you're pissing on a fairy tale if after all this time or all the hurdles you went through that you feel like you're grousing over what feel like little logistical details, but they're not so little. These aren't just small logistical details. They are red flags. They are your sense of reality, and it can be easy to get caught up in fighting hard to make it work after how much you did to make it happen. And when you throw in some trauma bonding and legacy issues in there, well, there you go. Needless to say, you are in trouble at that point. It's the preservation of the love story after all the hurdles that get messed up when the narcissist starts behaving badly, right? You think you've got your love story, and then you've got it all figured out, and then they start behaving badly, right? That's the big cognitive dissonance. And many people will just try to rectify the dissonance by not only justifying, but perhaps even doubling down. For example, saying, I'm going to make this love story work, so you know what? We're getting married, or they'll move in together, or have children, or move far away to be with this person. By doing these big ticket things as part of your big love story, it creates a distraction, a smokescreen that allows you to focus on a wedding, or buying furniture, or picking out baby names, instead of addressing gaslights, emotional abuse, and contempt. Then one day you look up and the mess is far bigger than you can imagine. You can imagine you can't even imagine crawling out of this mess. When you do the actual post-mortem of the relationship, it makes sense. And you may even be able to feel that sense of anxious urgency that accompanied the early days of the relationship. The chaos of the early parts of many narcissistic relationships means that people often eagerly await or even rush into the decisions that can make the chaos feel more stable. Moving in, getting engaged, doing things that feel like planting a flag, but are just masking the difficulties that keep popping up. The slippery beginnings, the hard to getness, them playing hard to get, the odd timing, the triangulated chaos, all of these things that often accompany a person who's narcissistic can actually really, really play into the fantasy of being the one who finally wins, who gets the against the odds big love story. Too many people come out of childhood with the fantasy of wanting to be chosen and for someone to make an effort or for the story to somehow work out. Remember that narcissistic relationships tend to have more of these chaotic bumps and grinds and shimmies early on. And people who are narcissistic, they sure do love a chase. Nobody wins in a chase. Let's face it, once the gazelle gets caught, it's checkmate. I suppose one could argue that the lion gets their dinner. Chases are only intriguing while they are happening. But once they're over, it really just sort of settles into contempt and destruction. There is a saying in an Indian language the language that my family speaks, and basically the way the saying translates into someone being a monkey with a coconut. My mother would say that when someone got something, okay, that they didn't know what to do with, they'd be flummoxed by this thing that they have, right? And so the example in this story that she would use, she'd explain to me that monkeys would sometimes scramble up the trees and fetch the coconuts off the trees, or they'd find them on the ground. But once the monkey had the coconut, the monkey actually couldn't figure out how to get the coconut out of the husk or crack the shells to get the meat in the water. They suspected that there's something good in there. They weren't clear on how to get it. So maybe that's what anyone is when they first land the narcissistic partner. The proverbial monkey with a coconut. The monkey is lucky, though. The monkey typically learns to give up after a while once it can't get what it needs from the coconut. After a fair amount of frustration, obviously, trying to get it, but then they know when to quit. And then the monkey will go out looking for more fruitful food sources. Unfortunately, people may not be as clever as those monkeys, and they hang on too long despite all of the frustration, carrying that coconut around for a long time, never being able to extract food from it, and slowly starving to death. So pay attention to that dynamic. When you feel like you've had to work so hard and waited for so much timing, and everything came together, and oh my gosh, they left their partner and I'm with them. When you have all that buy-in, be very, very careful that you don't get blinded or distracted by all of that and not pay attention to the very real red flags that are in front of you and then become that proverbial monkey with a coconut. So let's talk about this time, the proverb for this time, which is actions speak louder than words. Now, all of you have heard this proverb many, many times, probably since you were a child. The origins of this proverb are actually a little bit hard to pin down. Some have said that a variation of this proverb has been around since the time of actually Greek philosophers. Some have attributed it to Montaigne. But yet others have pinned it to some of the writings, to some different writings that came out in the mid-1600s. Abraham Lincoln was actually the first to be documented using the phrase "actions speak louder than words" in its modern form. So it's had some sort of circuitous history, but most people almost can pin its current form to Abraham Lincoln. Now, it's very obvious what it means. Do it, don't say it, right? Many people say they're going to do something. It doesn't mean anything until they actually say it. Someone can tell you 1,000 times they love you and never really show it in their actions or in a behavioral shift or in a meaningful behavioral change. And for most of you watching this, it is obvious how this saying, actions speak louder than words, connects to narcissism and to narcissistic relationships. At least I hope it is. So any of you saying, probably those of you who've been in narcissistic relationships have even used this phrase or used this proverb in communicating about your relationship. Now, a major issue, and tying this proverb to narcissistic relationships, a major issue in narcissistic relationships is the lack of behavioral change in response to feedback. For example, if you were to say to whomever the difficult narcissistic people are or person in your life is, it would mean a lot. Like, for example, let's say you said to them, it would mean a lot to me if you would ask me about my day. Since you're already, or something like, since you're already driving past the store, could you pick up the prescriptions that we need? Or something like, could you try to come home for dinner? I know that this past week you've been going out with your friends a lot. Would you come home for dinner? Or you might say, I'm a little uncomfortable with how you go silent when you travel for business, and that when you travel, you actually don't even get in touch with me. At a minimum, could you at least let me know you arrived safely? These are all very little asks in any kind of relationship, right? And when you make these little asks, like, could you pick up the prescriptions on the way home? So often in narcissistic relationships, these little asks go unheard. And you sort of have a life of unemptied dishwashers, to text messages that don't get returned, to dogs that don't ever get walked, to the just simple pleasantries of life that could really make a household run more smoothly. And then you might actually try to communicate with the narcissist and say, it feels like you don't listen to me, no matter how many times I ask you to do something. And they may respond with something like, I'm listening, I'm just busy, I'm listening, stop complaining, and the beat goes on and the things don't get done. A narcissistic person may talk a really tough game about being a great parent, but they're never interested in things like overseeing homework or coordinating appointments. A narcissistic person may talk about being a great boss, but turn around and steal your work. They may talk about being a great friend and never return your calls, especially when you're at a time of need. The lack of insight in most narcissistic people, coupled with the grandiosity, means that people who are narcissistic are good at talking, but they're not good at doing, because the doing is inconvenient and troublesome. And words are often sufficient for them to prop up their fragile egos. They'll talk a good game, and just the talking is enough for them to say, oh, I'm great, but they don't connect it to the doing. The disconnect between what a narcissistic person says and what a narcissistic person does is what makes these narcissistic relationships so difficult. Now, if the narcissists in your lives were your parents, it may have been particularly challenging because children really, really do need action. Words are important, but actions are what really, really matter to children. So the big talking narcissistic parent who never came through for you, never played ball in the backyard, never did arts and crafts, never came to the practices, never baked the cake with you, never did the camping trip, never did the fishing trip, never did the hiking, whatever it was you wanted as a child. It really sets up that vulnerability to enduring less in adulthood relationships. You got so little in childhood, you actually become vulnerable to enduring that lessness in your adult relationships and enduring the lack of action that you may experience in adult relationships and maybe not call it out because you got so accustomed to it as a child. Some people out there get lost in the love language matrix and will simply say that the people who care that actions speak louder than words, they're just the acts of service people, and that people who don't need or value or desire acts of service are actually fine with no action. Probably not. Heck, I've been a teacher for years, and if a student told me, hey doc, I thought about what you said, I thought a lot about what you talked about in class, but I didn't do the assignment, but it's all up in here, that person is still going to get a 0 on the assignment. Half of life may be showing up, but the bigger half may be actually doing it. And the doing is often what is lacking in narcissistic relationships. Now, some of you may be watching this and thinking to yourself or saying, my problem is actually the opposite. I'm in a narcissistic relationship where they do stuff, and they actually do a lot of stuff. They fix stuff, they buy stuff, they never sit still, they're always doing, but they never, ever, ever share anything emotionally. They never, ever really evidence real empathy or anything that implies emotion. And when I, in this relationship, ask for that, ask for some emotion or feeling or awareness, they will often, the narcissistic person will often give a long speech about how much they do and how lazy I am for demanding and asking for all this talk after all they do. Perhaps in some narcissistic relationships, as a flip side, words and emotions might actually speak a little louder than actions, especially if the actions aren't even responsive to anyone else's needs but the narcissistic person's needs. I understand that, and it is not an uncommon dynamic. Some will even say that they have a parent, for example, even as adults, they have a parent who sends them gifts and sends them cards and gives them things that they don't need and sends them messages and texts with all these strange articles attached as though they think that you might be interested. And that parent of that adult child will say, look how much I love you, I'm doing all these things. But all that doing is not at all aligned with what their adult child wants or needs. And when the parent criticizes the adult child, and you, as their adult child, push back, like, stop sending me this, just be present, just listen to me, You'll get a lot from your narcissistic parent. A lot of things like, I do so much, I give you so much, you're never satisfied. I don't know why I try. And you're thinking, I just want you to listen to me. So in narcissistic relationships, the challenge always is that the words and the actions don't match up. And some kind of consistency and balance sure would be nice. And so maybe it's even a little less about actions speaking louder than words, but maybe actions and words needing to talk to each other. Hope that helps you understand a little bit about how yet another classical proverb links to how we think about narcissistic relationships. Fall 7 times, stand up 8. So this is actually a Japanese proverb, a Zen proverb. I was not able to find anywhere why they chose 7 times versus any other number. If any of you know why they chose 7 for this particular proverb, please tell me, because I researched it, I couldn't find it. But there's an interesting, that 7 actually ends up becoming quite interesting in a minute, and you'll see. I had actually, like I said, not heard this one, but I've heard variants of this proverb, things like getting back on the horse after you fall off, that kind of thing. But there's a definite sort of sense of persistence built into this one, right? 7 times fall, 8th time up, and I guess you stay up, right? As with so many proverbs, there is both a good and healthy bit of wisdom in this one, as well as some potentially risky suggestions. Again, all of these proverbs have that with specifically in terms of narcissistic relationships. Now, in this case, in this proverb, I see much more of the positive than the negative, but we'll get to both. Now, my interpretation of this proverb is probably quite similar to the rest of yours, is that even with multiple failures or multiple setbacks, you can still get up one more time. And when I initially read it, I like to think that when the person got up for the 8th time, they stayed up. Now, a narcissistic relationship is an unwanted class in resilience. That's you learn it, but in a kind of icky way. After getting through these relationships, many, though I understand not all, many people find a strength, a flexibility, acceptance, grace, and wisdom that they did not know that they have. Those that can go all in on radical acceptance and realistic expectations and discernment and self-advocacy, they come out as rather solid units in terms of people that they are. I was listening to a friend talk to a group recently, and it made me happy to see her get it. She said that once you start talking about narcissistic abuse in a group of people, the people who actually get it, you can really see it in their eyes. And I have to say, I have the privilege and honor of doing this work, and I see it all the time. I see it in their eyes, in my clients, in people with whom I've been do speaking engagements with, in my colleagues, and even in strangers. You can always see the survivors. There's just something in their eyes. Now, a narcissistic relationship is a study in confusion, and then education, and then pattern detection. It is a journey into disappointment, frustration, confusion, helplessness, anxiety, self-blame, and self-doubt. There's 7 falls right there. And then hopefully that 8th time, getting up and staying up. This proverb also evokes some thoughts about hoovering, right? That a person in a narcissistic relationship will repeatedly get hoovered into the relationship. Interestingly, the National Domestic Violence Hotline and other sources have reported that a woman in a domestically abusive relationship will return an average of 7 times to an abusive relationship. That means that hoovering, sadly and tragically, is to be accepted, and the irony of that statistic of 7 times was not lost on me in lieu of this proverb. Each time a person leaves, they take a tremendous risk in a domestically abusive relationship. In narcissistically abusive relationships, it may be a risk to safety, but it is also a risk psychologically. However, the hope is that each time there may be a connection that's made to resources, to mental health care, to other supports. Maybe each time, if the person survives, they will get to a point where they can commit to safely leaving, or that other systems may make it possible to finally stay away. For example, incarceration of the offender, or the perpetrator just moves on to something or someone else. Many people become very self-blaming and very self-disparaging when they go back, and things end up just as bad as always. I always want to reassure them that returning and going back into those relationships is normal and it's part of the process. We as people simply do not have sufficient access to the information, the mental health services, and the support that people need to make these transitions. And then, when you couple that with trauma bonding, fear, cognitive dissonance, and intergenerational cycles, it actually would be unusual for a person to be one and done in terms of leaving one of these relationships. The falling down more than once is part of the process of letting go of a narcissistic relationship. There is a point when there's sort of an inflection point. You have enough support, information, and data based on your experience, coupled with internal strength, or maybe a devil-may-care attitude. You just had it, and a person gets out. It is often quite messy, expensive, painful, and traumatic to leave. But that time finally comes, and people do leave. Falling and getting up is the nature of these cycles and these relationships. In the classical narcissistic relationship cycle, we talk about love bombing, devaluing, discarding, and hoovering, and cycles tend to repeat, falling down and then getting back up. And keep in mind that leaving a narcissistic relationship is not the only way of getting back up. People cannot always leave these relationships. And in those cases, and they may not always want to leave, and in those cases, the getting back up may be learning about boundaries, having realistic expectations, maintaining radical acceptance, learning to gray rock, cultivating other sources of support, getting into therapy, and learning more about these cycles. Getting back up then becomes taking back some aspects of your life and no longer letting the narcissist control the emotional thermostat. It can feel like a rather superficial and unsatisfying relationship if you do stay in it, but at a minimum, you are avoiding the gaslighting, or at least dodging it, and as well as some of the abuse. Survivorship and healing from narcissistic abuse doesn't always look the same, and it is a long-term, ongoing process. That Zen proverb, that Zen 8th time that you get up, looks different for everyone. Learning to manage the relationship, getting out, forgiving yourself, and not blaming yourself for what happened because you're not responsible, to just keep standing and being compassionate with yourself is a critical part of healing. There is the risk of this proverb of being heard as just keep trying in one of these relationships. Maybe this will change. No, it's not likely to change. So if you keep falling back in for that reason, that will leave you hurt. But if you don't let it break you and learn about it and slowly figure out what works for you, then that is all we can hope for with this 7 down, 8 up proverb. Resilience and persistence are so apparent in survivors of narcissistic abuse. And after years of being told that you are not resilient, it can be difficult to believe it. But believe it. Anyone who can get up to do another day, to get through another day, after living in a gaslighted, upside-down world, well, as far as I'm concerned, that's as resilient as it comes. So, fall 7, get up 8, and actually the coincidence of that domestic violence statistic with this proverb really quite shocked me. Thanks again.